Richard Boyd-Barrett, please.
Taoiseach, the world is absolutely rightly horrified at the unfolding disaster that is being unleashed on the people of Ukraine with Putin's absolutely bloody, inexcusable and murderous invasion of Ukraine. And Ireland's voice needs to be absolutely clear in condemning utterly that murderous invasion. And we need to, as I think it's clear the people of this country want to, extend every form of humanitarian assistance and support to those suffering under the bombs and bullets and shells of the Russian military, to those who are fleeing their homes to escape this bloody conflict, and to provide refuge, and to be as generous as we possibly can to provide refuge for those fleeing from the Ukrainian crisis. What I have to say, Taoiseach, is it is extremely worrying to me that it seems that there is a clamour of media commentators, and more seriously, yourself and leading government ministers who seem to be trying to exploit this Ukrainian tragedy and crisis to argue that we need to move Ireland away from its traditional position of military neutrality and move closer to NATO and to the project of European militarisation. The latest example of this, we heard it from the Taoiseach last week, we've heard it from you, and the latest example of this is from Simon Coveney in New York, speaking to the US Council of Foreign Relations, a body packed with hundreds of senior government officials, arguing that we needed to consider greater cooperation with NATO and increased arms expenditure. Now, I find it absolutely extraordinary that in the face of the dire consequences of warmongering and militarism on the part of Putin, that there is a thought that somehow more militarism, more arms expenditure, and allying more closely with a military alliance that has also conducted and supported murderous wars elsewhere in the world is somehow a legitimate response. If we are opposed to, and we must be opposed to, Putin's brutal and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine, we should not respond to that by joining an alliance dominated by powers that, for example, are supporting the Saudi dictatorship, conducting an equally murderous war in Yemen that has killed more than 300,000 people over the last 4 years and is now, according to the UN, brought 14 million people to the brink of starvation. Or to continue to ignore what Amnesty are calling the crimes against humanity that Israel commit against Palestinians, supported and armed indeed by the United States and the Western powers. So I ask you, Taoiseach, in the face of this tragedy, is it not time to recommit to Ireland's position of military neutrality, which does not mean ignoring this crisis, but being a voice for sanity against the madness of warmongering and militarism?
Taoiseach.
First of all, thank the Deputy for raising the issue, and I agree that Russia stands condemned in the International Court of Opinion for its appalling atrocities against the civilian population of Ukraine, for its unjustifiable and unprovoked war on Ukraine and on the territorial integrity of Ukraine and its sovereignty. And everybody else tried everything to stop Russia from going to war. Leading NATO countries that you decry on an ongoing basis and that you accuse of being militarist in their orientation did everything they could to say to President Putin, you don't need to go to war. Any security concerns you have can be transparently dealt with in terms of either missile deployment or troops deployment on the continent of Europe. If you have issues with deployments in Eastern Europe, talk, let's have a forum for discussion. That needs to be acknowledged, and you need to acknowledge that too. Because I can recall 2 or 3 weeks ago, you were describing NATO as the warmongers in this situation, when they were far from it. There was only one warmonger here, and that was Russia. But in terms of what you might describe as the clamour of media commentators around the issue of neutrality, that's called democracy. We might not like views, but that's democracy. We can't decry the clamour of commentators. We should actually embrace the clamour of commentary, because that represents diversity of opinion and of viewpoints and the rights of people to reflect, because this crisis does cause a need for further reflection on overall security architecture within Europe and within the wider world. Now, Ireland has a tradition of military non-alignment or military neutrality. We've never been politically neutral. And indeed, even in 1939, when the German representative came to the then Irish government, it was made very clear to the German representative of the closeness and how Britain would always have to get consideration. And that's, De Valera himself said that, because he said it rendered it inevitable that for the Irish government to show a certain consideration for Britain. And likewise, as we've evolved through our membership of the European Union, we've developed in 1999 the Partnership for Peace with NATO in order to sustain interoperability if we were on peace missions or peace enforcement missions with NATO countries. We've been part of PESCO. We've been part of battle groups, none of which were ever deployed, but which ensured that Irish defence forces were at a certain moderate competence and capacity to enable them to do what we do best, which is peacekeeping. Ireland, I think, does peacekeeping well, and I think we've the longest unbroken record in terms of peacekeeping since about 1957, when we first started our peacekeeping role in the world. But we do need a discussion on this, and what I would suggest we should, not right now, in the middle of a terrible war, we should be concentrating our resources on helping the people of Ukraine in a practical way. I think we could look at a citizens' assembly to discuss these issues in the fullness of time.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Where detailed, prepared submissions and perspectives from a wide range of opinion could be articulated. Not now, we need to concentrate on the war effort in terms of helping people come out of that and stopping the war, and in terms of supporting the people of Ukraine should be our immediate priority, not to get, if you like, diverted on a debate around military neutrality and so on. It hasn't stopped anything that we need to do with our European colleagues in respect of helping Ukraine.
Please, before we go on, can I just ask Deputy, will you please adhere to the time allocated, please? Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
Taoiseach, this morning I received an email from a former member of the Defence Forces who described how at every single military checkpoint he or any other Irish soldier was ever at, their safety and our credibility was protected by our neutrality. And he goes on to say, but lately we pick our fights, and the more we do so, the more we lose our integrity. And he asked me to urge this House to keep the faith with military neutrality for that reason. And you see, that's the problem. Because to me, if we oppose the madness that we are seeing unfolding in Ukraine, we have to be consistent in opposing all militarism, all imperialism, not selective. So absolutely we must condemn Putin's brutal invasion. But are we going to condemn less what the Saudi dictatorship is doing in Yemen now, supported by the US and UK, members of NATO, armed to the teeth by the West? Or what Amnesty are describing as crimes against humanity on an ongoing basis against the Palestinian people, but we say nothing about it. Doesn't neutrality mean standing against all warmongering and all dictators? And don't we have to hold fast to that tradition which indeed helped found this state with the ideas of people like Connolly and the rebels of 1916 rebelling against the madness of the First World War?
Taoiseach, please.
You were recently elected to the United Nations Security Council, which is about as good a benchmark for our credibility on the international world than anything else I can think of. And that is because, yes, we have pursued an independent foreign policy as members of the European Union, probably the greatest characteristic of which has been our nuclear non-proliferation initiatives, beginning with the then Minister for Foreign Affairs, Frank Aiken, as part of the Irish resolutions at the UN in the 50s, which true architect of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And those are the kind of issues that you need to work through in terms of anybody's reflections on how we might evolve our independent foreign policy within the European Union context and our solidarity with European Union nations. And to be fair to all the commentaries so far, people are pointing up that the world is changing. President Putin has fundamentally changed the multilateral rules-based order by the nature of his unprovoked attack on Ukraine. It would be foolish to ignore that reality. Europe is actually very exposed. The European Union is exposed, security-wise, in respect of what now has happened.